the Armenian genocide, the 1915 genocide, is very much understudied. It is understudied because the bulk of the books, academic books about the subject, are very recent. And the basic argument is this a genocide or not? And this is the result, of course, of Turkish official state policy of denialism. But I think the Turkish state policy has hijacked the debate about the 1915 genocide. That it was a genocide, everyone knew about it as it was happening. I will quote a telegram sent by French, British, and Russian foreign ministries to the Ottoman foreign ministry on May 24, 1915. So exactly 1 month after the arrests of 200 and something intellectuals, weeks after the rumors or the information about massacres taking place in the Van province was reaching big cities, the foreign ministries of the three powers in war with the Ottoman Empire knew what was happening. So I'm quoting. In view of these new crimes against humanity and civilization, the Allied government announces publicly to the Supreme Court that they will hold personally responsible these crimes all members of the Ottoman government and those of their agents who are implicated in such massacres. So basically, we have all the elements of genocide. It's state responsibility to be held personally, and in the telegram they talk about deportations and massacres of Christian subjects of the empire. So this is a very small example, but we have many, many others. For example, we have the publication in 1916 of the Blue Book by Viscount Bryce and, of course, the famous historian Arnold Toynbee. 600 and something pages of documentation looking at the deportations, massacres of Armenians, Assyrians, and others. In Germany, we have, of course, the efforts of Johannes Lepsius, who, during the war, by his personal efforts, published documentation in 25,000 copies that he tried to distribute over the German elite, politicians, intellectuals, and so on, to inform them about what was happening and urging them to take steps to stop the crime from happening. And we have, of course, the Ottoman military courts after the war, 1919-20, trying to address the crimes committed by the Ittihadists and to bring them to justice. So today, our dear friend Taner Akçam can still discover documents. It will make a buzz. It will make New York Times article. But we have thousands of documents. And the bulk of the information that we use today to rewrite our history books comes from documentations that were collected during the war. I didn't mention Morgenthau. I didn't mention Armenian efforts to document them. Andonian, here, Yesayan, Tumanian, who were doing interviews with the refugees coming from the Ottoman Empire to document what was happening. So we know about the genocide as it was happening. We are not adding anything to it. We are playing with interpretations, but the information is there. So the debate about whether it was a genocide or not, from a historian's perspective, is a stupid debate. It's a political debate. It's not a historical debate. Historians can try to contextualize it, can try to give interpretations to it, but that it was mass extermination, we knew about it. But by hijacking the debate, we missed the significance of this event. We missed its importance for Armenians, but not only. This event shaped also Turkey. this event also shaped modern human history. Just to give you some figures to illustrate what I'm talking about. The First World War was a horrible war, right? There were millions of people died. We don't even know exactly how many. But it was around 11 to 13 million people. The majority of those who died during the First World War were soldiers wearing uniform who died from wounds on the war fronts. Probably between 8 and 9 million of them. The civilians who died during the First World War were a minority. Most of the civilians who died in the First World War were Ottoman subjects, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians. And they died not because of enemy armies. They died because their state decided to exterminate them. So this is very important. In Europe, it's something different. You know, the violence that was exercised on European fronts was of a different sort. Now, in the Second World War already, the relationship changed. In the Second World War, there too, we don't have exact estimates of people who died. But it's between 60, 70 to 85 million. The majority are civilians. So we see the consequences of the First World War and what was happening in the Ottoman Empire, the targeting of civilians, which should be forbidden, illegal by any standards, legal, religious, moral. We see that the fact that this crime went unrecognized and unpunished had consequences on the Second World War. Now I said the Armenian genocide is understudied. But before moving on with this idea, I will say that we talk a lot about Turkish official denialism. And I would qualify that as progress compared to what was there before the denial. Because denialism as a state policy is the result, is the outcome of the 1980s. So before the 1980s, there was something different there, which I would call Oblivion. And this is an idea which is troubling me a lot. I will try to draw its borders, its limits, but it's something which has enormous consequences, which frightens me. So for many, many decades, the Armenian genocide was an Armenian affair. And it was an Armenian private affair. For example, I grew up in Lebanon. In Lebanon, before 1965, the Armenians commemorated April 24 in church ceremony or in private houses where they closed the curtains. It was a private mourning event. It didn't concern the rest of the Lebanese. It didn't concern the rest of the humanity because the rest of humanity forgot about this event. And of course, this oblivion, this forgetting about a major event, as I showed, it was an event of historical importance to humanity, not just for the victims. But I would like to bring another quotation just so that you get a feeling of what it means to forget. And the quotation is from Taner Akçam in an interview I did with him 5 years back, in fact, in 2012. And Taner Akçam, he's known as the first Turkish scholar who write about the genocide of the Armenians. Before that, Taner Akçam has a very interesting life. He was a young Turkish student originating from Eastern Turkey, studying in Ankara. And like many of his generation, he became member of a left-wing movement, Devrimci Gençlik, Revolutionary Youth. And he was arrested, he was put in prison, from where he escaped, quite Romanesque, the way he escaped. And finally, he arrives in Germany as political asylum seeker. And it was only in Germany when he was invited to do research on torture in, it was part of a bigger research, and he was, the people studying torture in prisons, and he, as someone who had gone through the Turkish prison system, he was invited to take part in studying torture in Turkish prisons. And while doing this research, he first discovered that there was something called Hamidian massacres in his country. And he says, this was the first time I came to the subject of the Armenians. Before that, I did not know anything about it. It was not a subject for the Turkish left, who considered Armenians and Asala as suspicious, as instruments of Western imperialism. As I progressed in my readings of Abdul Hamid massacres, I thought to myself, I know the history of the French Revolution, of Russia in 1917, of Chinese communism, but I do not know Turkish history. I mean, I want to just take this moment. I mean, can you imagine someone who doesn't belong to the state, doesn't belong to the bureaucracy, someone who thinks about himself as revolutionary, someone who wants to overthrow the existing order, and doesn't know that in his country there was a genocide, that 20 to 25% of the population during the First World War, Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, were uprooted, killed, deported, whatever. But a quarter of the population of his country is not there. And he doesn't know not only about this event, but he doesn't know anything about those populations. And he doesn't want to know about it. So what I'm trying to see is that there's something more than state denialism and state censorship. There's something in the culture of the 20th century which makes it possible for crimes of genocide to take place, and it makes it possible for people like Taner Akçam to forget about it. It's frightening, isn't it? It does frighten me. So, Uğur made a quote coming probably from today's Turkish president, Mr. Erdogan, who for the first time in 2005, just before the 90th commemoration of the genocide, wrote a letter. He was then prime minister. He wrote a letter to then president of Armenia, Vicken Cheterian, in which he said, Turkish archives are open. The border is closed, but archives are open. So let's have a historians commission to study about the events. So I would like to, as a historian, to reflect about how is it possible that after 90 years, 100 years, we still think that we need commissions to think about what happened 100 years back. And the subject of our study is not a minor subject, like, for example, the commercial ties between one commercial company and another in Venice in 16th century. So it's not a detail like this. We are talking about, as I said, the extermination of 2 to 4 million people and their uprooting. So in case we need 100 years to study the nature of what happened, then are there students of history in the whole? Why do we study history? In case after 100 years, we cannot even say a genocide is genocide. What is the purpose of studying history? Does the knowledge of history serve something? Does it make sense to study history? Or shall we close down university faculties doing that futile exercise? This reminds me an interview I had with a Tutsi survival of the genocide in Rwanda. And he was describing in their village how they tried to manage justice after the genocide. And he was saying that, there were so many people who were killed and there were so many perpetrators around who were arrested that justice in any physical procedural sense was not possible. So what they did was just to confront the perpetrators with the survivors and their families, just to have confessions and to move on. So this shows that after genocide, justice in any regular sense is not possible. But also, history after genocide is impossible, because we can always say archives are open after we know that half the archives are destroyed by now. We can always say, yes, the document that you are showing, basically it's fake. I'm referring to Andonian papers. So we can question the validity of the account of the survivors, because they are biased, right? They are nationalists, they are anti-Turk. So can we take their accounts seriously? This was the case for many decades. When the first Armenian scholars started writing about the genocide, that was the 1980s, many scholarly conferences looked down when there were Armenians suggesting to present papers as, you know, again, those Armenians who want to talk about their problem with the Turks. You know, it's as if it was an Armenian problem. The consequences of the 1915 crime are enormous. As I tried to make the parallel before between First World War and Second World War, today we know that there's organic link between the genocide and the Holocaust. It had to take nearly 100 years so that we move away from the simple quote of Hitler's speech in September 1939, who remembers the Armenians, so that, as Eric has done, to show that there are thousands of documents and not just one quote to fight about. But there's other dimensions which we also forget, which is that the 1915 genocide changed the history of the Middle East. And we still write history books of the Middle East where this event is absent. Today, when I talk about Greeks, many people get the impression that Greeks are Europeans. Well, Greeks are Middle Eastern people. Alexandria in Egypt, the second city, was historically a Greek city. Greeks lived in Trabzon and Kayseri up to the First World War. Byzantine culture was largely based on Greek presence in Asia Minor. And it is the genocide of the First World War that pushed the Greeks out of Middle Eastern history and demography to make them a Balkanic European population. Armenians are Middle Eastern people. Armenians were present all over the Middle East throughout history. It's not by chance, as we say, that 1/4 of the historical city of Jerusalem is Armenian, because Armenians were there, because Armenians are part of Jerusalem and Palestine and Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia, not to mention West Armenia, historic Armenia and Asia Minor and Istanbul. But today Armenians became a Caucasian people, although in 1914 the majority of the Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire, 2/3 compared to 1/3 living in the Russian Empire. So this changed not only the Armenian identity, because the weight of Armenian culture, of Armenian economy, of Armenian presence was largely in the Ottoman Empire, in Istanbul, in different cities of the Ottoman Empire, where Armenians were the most important segment of the urban middle classes, bourgeoisie. And today we think about the Armenians as Caucasian and not Middle Eastern. This has consequences, as I said, on Armenian history and culture, but it has also consequences on Middle Eastern history and its development as it took place in the 20th century. Another subject that has not been studied because, as I said earlier, the debate has been hijacked on whether it is a genocide or not. Another question, which I think is very interesting for scholars, for those working on their PhDs, is the link between the 1915 exterminations and the increasingly confessional conflicts taking place in the Middle East. Is there a link or not? Is there one? The disappearance of Christian populations in the Middle East, hasn't it changed the balance of power within the remaining populations and reproducing the same mechanisms of conflict which has led today to the Shiite-Sunni conflict? We have made the parallel between the ISIS genocide against the Yazidis in Sinjar, but we haven't looked at the picture from a more global perspective, other topics to research. Now, very short comments on why, after such a long oblivion inside Turkey, why did this memory come back? And there, I think we have to look at two things. First is that the world changed. The ideologies that were dominant in the 20th century disappeared with the collapse of the USSR. And the 1990s opened a decade of idealism where things were possible. And it was a decade where human rights was pushed forward. And in this new discourse of human rights and end of dominant ideologies, the Armenians and the Armenian history, the extermination of the Armenians as well as Greeks and Assyrians, had a chance to be heard inside Turkey. And it was only after then friendship was possible between Turks and Armenians, because it was possible to talk about the genocide. Because without talking about the genocide, friendship and opening borders or normalizing relations is not possible. As you might have noticed, the quote that is in the title of my presentation is from a discussion between Talat and Morgenthau, and it is quoted by Morgenthau, where Talat says, after what we have done to them, it will not be possible to have even friendship between Armenians and Turks. The friendship was possible only after Turkish scholars like Taner Akçam started considering that the history of the exterminations, the history of the genocide, was also their history. This is a shared history. It is shared differently, but it is not just Armenian history. It is also Turkish history. It is also Kurdish history. Of course, the Turkish side of the history is a very different one. No, I don't want to go into this shared suffering, because the suffering is shared in a very qualitatively different manner, and the responsibilities in this crime and its denial is a different one. But because of the interest of Turkish scholars, friendship was possible. And I would say that the first friendship established was that between Taner Akçam and Vahagen Dadrian. And it was this collaboration which destroyed the possibility of denialism within Turkish university and academic circles. Armenian genocide, in one way, is the result of Armenian political and social activism within the Ottoman Empire. The Armenians were very, very present within the efforts of Tanzimat. For example, someone like Mithat Pasha, he had the author, the Grand Vizier who was behind the first constitution of the Ottomans. He had many Armenian lawyer colleagues and friends who helped him draft the constitution. Armenian community, the millet in the Ottoman Empire, had its own constitution before the Ottoman Empire had a constitution. So this shows how the Armenians were ahead of time within the Ottoman political culture. Armenian political parties were ahead of time compared to Turkish political parties, including the Young Turk Committee of Union and Progress. The first socialist party in the Ottoman Empire was an Armenian one. So somehow the Armenian extermination is a sad story of a region which missed an appointment with history, an appointment of reform, of constitution, of progress. And I think it is within this discourse that Armenian memory can return. And it was within these conditions that the debate of the Armenian past and absence emerged within Turkey. Now we are living sad times once again. In Turkey, the window of opportunity is being closed down. The perspective developments are within the limits of successful dictatorship or failed dictatorship leading to uncertainty. A civil war is taking place in the southeast. So all those intellectuals who in the last years were very active to push for the return of memory are losing their jobs. Some of them are being imprisoned. So it is sad times. But we have no other choice but books. As the anecdote told by Uğur, that when he went to this commemoration, he proved his being on the good side by showing books. Me too, when I was working on my book, Open Wounds, each and every single one I interviewed either had written books or had a book project. Human civilization, although neither books nor alphabet is an Armenian invention, I think we have very intimate relationship with books. We Armenians, we love writing books, I think. But apart from that, human civilization is largely told through books, through writing. And we can fight the darkness of our times only through education and writing. Thank you very much for your attention.